about the building blocks of sentences is an integral part of your journey towards English proficiency. This is because you need to be able to produce complex sentences in order to get certain messages across. And as you will learn, creating complex sentences is hugely important for achieving a high score in your IELTS writing section. It's easy to create simple sentences and convey simple ideas, but as you know, communicating is a bit more complicated than that, and there is a variety of sentence structures you can and should use for certain purposes. If you don't know how to do that yet, don't worry, because this lesson will take you through the basics of English sentence types and equip you with the knowledge and skills to use complex sentence structures so that you can not only achieve a high score in the IELTS writing section, but also so that you can communicate effectively, cohesively, and efficiently. So let's go over the objectives for this lesson. Firstly, you will learn all about clauses. Sounds like a big word, but don't stress about it. You'll get there. Now, once you're equipped with knowledge of clauses, you will go a step further and learn to use the sentence types. Simple sentences, compound sentences, and then eventually complex sentences. The main goal for you in this lesson is to be able to use complex sentences. So be sure to stick around until the end of this lesson so that you can master that skill. But before we get started with this lesson, of course, you know by now, we must first review the last lesson's challenge. In the last lesson, you learned about a variety of language functions. One of those functions was giving advice. As you know, giving advice is a very important part of forming friendships and professional relationships. In the last lesson's challenge, you were given the following scenario. Your friend is very sick. It seems like she has the flu. Write a few sentences giving her advice on how to relieve her flu symptoms. For example, have soup and drink ginger and lemon tea. Let's look at some possible answers. You should drink some ginger and lemon tea. If I were you, I'd stay at home and rest. You'd better take some medicine. These are some sentences I came up with, so remember that your advice may be different to mine, but hopefully you were able to utilize the general sentence structures for giving. I learn about the building blocks of sentences. Well, in the official IELTS criteria, it's written that in the IELTS writing section, you must use many complex sentences correctly to score band 7 or higher. Now, apart from IELTS, in your daily life, using complex sentences is really important if you want to share your complicated ideas with people. By the end of the lesson, you will understand how to use complex sentences. But before you can learn about the different types of sentences and ultimately upskill you in your writing abilities, you need to understand the concept of clauses. The concept of a clause might seem a little daunting, but it will make sense to you in due time. So let's uncover what exactly is a clause. A clause can be very simply described as a piece of language. If a sentence is a cake, a clause is a slice of that cake. Now, there are a few types of clauses that you need to know about. Firstly, there's the independent clause. If clauses are pieces of cake, then an independent clause is a cupcake. It can stand completely on its own. An independent clause functions as a whole sentence. It doesn't need anything else added to it to make it whole or complete. Some examples of independent clauses are as follows. She smokes cigarettes. Many cats like being stroked. Take a moment to look at these examples and see what's in the sentences. Do you see a verb? Yes. Do you see a subject? Yes. And if you don't know what a subject is, hold tight, we'll get there. Now, to qualify as an independent clause, the clause must contain at least one subject and at least one verb. You'll remember verbs from Module 1, but just as a quick reminder, verbs are doing words. Alright, so an independent clause contains a verb, but it also contains a subject. Do you know what a subject is? The subject is the noun that performs the verb. So that seems simple enough. So let's test if you can identify the subjects in some sentences. I'll give you a few seconds after each sentence to decide what the subject is. The boy kicked the ball. The little black dog licked the man's face. Some trees lose their leaves in winter. Alright, great job. Let's see if you got it right. In the first sentence, the boy is the subject. Note that the subject is not just boy. The subject is the whole noun phrase, and the determiner and any other words like adjectives would form part of the noun phrase. The boy is the subject of the sentence because the boy performs the verb or action of kicking the ball. The boy is the one doing the action, and therefore it's the subject. Now, in the next sentence, the subject is the little black dog. The little black dog is what performs the action or verb, and therefore it's the subject of the sentence. In the last sentence, the subject is some trees. This may seem a little less obvious because the tree isn't technically doing an action, but we can say that the tree is performing the verb lose. It's doing the losing, and thus some trees is the subject of the sentence. Before we move on to the next type of clause, let's just take a quick step back to review what you've learned so far. A clause is a piece of a sentence. An independent clause is a type of clause that doesn't need anything else attached to it. It can stand alone as a whole sentence. An independent clause contains at least one verb and one subject. Great. Now let's move on to the next type of clause, a subordinate clause. If an independent clause is a nice cupcake that can stand alone as a sentence, then a subordinate clause is one small slice of a bigger cake. A subordinate clause cannot stand alone as a sentence. It needs to be attached to an independent clause, otherwise it doesn't make sense. For example, even though some cats don't like it. While she talks to her friends. These clauses don't function as sentences. They don't make any sense on their own. They need to be attached to an independent clause in order to make sense. Now, I know what you must be thinking right now. I see a subject and a verb, so why is this not an independent clause? How can you tell if something is a subordinate clause? Well, that's simple. It's a subordinate clause if it starts with a subordinating conjunction. You can think of a subordinate clause as a small child who needs to be with a parent. A small child always needs to be supervised by a parent. He or she cannot be alone. A subordinate clause always needs to be with an independent clause. It cannot stand alone. So, as you now know, subordinate clauses contain subordinating conjunctions. In Module 1, when I taught you about conjunctions for the first time, I promised you that you'd learn more about conjunctions in this module. So, today is the day I teach you about conjunctions. Subordinating conjunctions are just one type of conjunctions. There are many subordinating conjunctions, too many to list in this lesson. But I will go over a few with you to give you an idea. So first we've got subordinating conjunctions of comparison, than, rather than, whereas, etc. Then we have time, until, after, now that, while, etc. Then we have concession, although, even though, etc. Then we have relative pronouns, who, whoever, whose, and so on. Then we have reason, since, so that, because, as, etc. Then condition, unless, if, provided that, etc. Place, wherever, where, etc. Relative adjectives, whatever, that, which, and so on. And lastly, manner, how, as though, as if, etc. These are all examples of subordinating conjunctions. Now, don't worry too much about words like comparison, time, concession, and so on. They're just there to show you that the different subordinating conjunctions have different purposes in a sentence. For now, just take note of the subordinating conjunctions themselves. So, just a reminder of how all of this fits together. Subordinate clauses begin with subordinating conjunctions. Here are the examples of subordinate clauses we looked at before. Note how they begin with subordinating conjunctions. Even though some cats don't like it. While she talks to her friends. Like I mentioned before, these clauses can't function alone as a sentence like independent clauses can. As you can see, they don't make sense. We have to attach them to an independent clause. So, let's do it. Remember the examples of independent clauses we looked at earlier? Many cats like being stroked. She smokes cigarettes. Great, so we've got our independent clauses. Now let's add the subordinate clauses. Many cats like being stroked, even though some cats don't like it. Great, that's our subordinate clause. She smokes cigarettes while she talks to her friends. And there's another subordinate clause. I have some good news for you. You just learned about complex sentences. It doesn't get any more complicated than that. Complex sentences contain an independent clause and at least one subordinate clause. And that's what we've just done. So let's do a quick recap of what you've learned so far. An independent clause contains at least one subject and at least one verb. It can stand alone as a sentence. A subordinate clause starts with a subordinating conjunction. It cannot stand alone. it must be attached to an independent clause. And when you attach a subordinate clause to an independent clause, you have a complex sentence. Now, these are all really big words, and this information will only really start to sink in once we discuss all the different types of sentences. But before we do that, let's talk about what you can expect in Lesson 4. You will learn all about sentence scrambling. You will learn how to change the order of sentences by changing them from active to passive form and from passive to active form. You will also learn why it's appropriate and when it's appropriate to use active or passive forms, which will really help you with your writing skills. So I look forward to seeing you there. Alright, so now that we have discussed clauses, we can start talking about the different types of sentences. So first we have simple sentences. Let's explore. What are simple sentences? You'll be pleased to learn that you already know simple sentences. Simple sentences contain just one independent clause. Remember, an independent clause contains at least one subject and at least one verb. We can use the same examples as before. She smokes cigarettes. Many cats like being stroked. Each of these sentences contains only one independent clause, and therefore they are simple sentences. It's okay to use simple sentences in your writing. However, in your IELTS writing section, try not to rely too heavily on simple sentences. You need to show your examiner that you can use other types of sentences too. Remember, to score band 7 and higher, you must be able to use complex and compound sentence structures correctly. So, on that note, let's move on to compound sentences. So, what are compound sentences? Well, compound sentences contain at least two independent clauses. The independent clauses are usually joined by coordinating conjunctions. Now remember, there are two types of conjunctions, so don't confuse coordinating conjunctions with subordinating conjunctions from earlier in this lesson. Subordinating conjunctions join independent clauses to subordinate clauses, whereas coordinating conjunctions join two independent clauses. So here are some examples of compound sentences. I saw Kathy yesterday and she mentioned you were feeling unwell. He attended his class, but he hasn't completed his assignment yet. The parts of the sentences written in pink are the independent clauses. As you can see, they are joined by coordinating conjunctions and but. So on that note, let's quickly go over the coordinating conjunctions that join compound sentences. Luckily, there are only 7 coordinating conjunctions, and there's a trick you can use to remember them. Fanboys. Each letter of the word fanboys represents a coordinating conjunction. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. And that's it. Those are all the coordinating conjunctions you need to know. Okay, now that you understand simple and compound sentences, it's time to look at complex sentences again. You've already had a taster of what complex sentences look like, so let's go over complex sentences in detail now. So, as we discussed earlier in this lesson, complex sentences contain one independent clause and one subordinate clause. The two clauses are joined by subordinating conjunctions. Remember that subordinate clauses begin with subordinating conjunctions. So those subordinating conjunctions join the clauses. Some examples of complex sentences are as follows. I'll come visit you after I leave work. As you can see, the sentence contains the subordinating conjunction after, and therefore it's a complex sentence. He ordered a salad rather than fries. This sentence contains the subordinating conjunction rather than and is therefore a complex sentence. Now it's time to practice your knowledge of complex sentences. As you know, complex sentences are joined by subordinating conjunctions. So, choose the correct subordinating conjunction for this sentence. I'll give you a few seconds to have a read. The correct subordinating conjunction is because. I'm not hungry because I had a big breakfast. I had a big breakfast is a reason for not being hungry. So it makes sense to use a subordinating conjunction of reason, namely because. Let's do another one. Choose the correct subordinating conjunction for this sentence. Again, I'll give you a few seconds to have a read. The correct subordinating conjunction is unless. I can't afford that expensive car unless I win the lottery. Winning the lottery is the condition for not being able to afford the car, so it makes sense to use a subordinating conjunction of condition, namely unless. Okay, last one. Choose the correct subordinating conjunction for this sentence. Take a few seconds to have a read. The correct subordinating conjunction is now that. I don't need to walk anymore now that I have a car. Before I had the car, I had to walk. Now I don't need to walk anymore because I have the car now. The use of the word now that is correct here. Well done. Now before we wrap up, let's have a quick recap. Simple sentences contain one independent clause. Compound sentences contain two or more independent clauses, and they are joined by coordinating conjunctions, which you can remember with the word fanboys. Complex sentences contain one independent clause and at least one subordinate clause. They are joined by a subordinating conjunction. And there you have it. You now know all about some of the subordinating conjunctions you learned about in this lesson. This challenge will help you practice building complex sentences. Now that you are equipped with the skills to create different types of sentences, you no longer have to rely on simple sentences only. You can express more complicated ideas through your skillful use of compound and, more importantly, complex sentences. Your writing abilities will significantly increase from here because of your newly improved ability to connect different types of clauses with one another. Remember that practice makes perfect. So do go on and practice building compound and complex sentences using the correct conjunctions.